प्रसार भारती अभिलेखागार की प्रस्तुति सदाबहार सुनहरे दौर का अनमोल खजाना.
So, sir, what I find from your account that your initial time in Moscow were very difficult, and it was very difficult to strike with with Soviets, and Mrs. Pandit could not meet even the premier of USSR. So, how did you ultimately function in Moscow? Will you give us your account of it?
Well, I must say, quite frankly, it was a period of great frustration. I was never, not once, during my 2-year stay, asked to go to the Foreign Office. But I used to make it a habit to go there once a month, at least, just to have a talk if I could get them to say anything to me. But don't forget, it was the immediate post-war period, early 1948, and the Soviet Union had suffered terribly from the war. And in Moscow and all around Moscow, there were signs of the recent struggle. Tank traps, trenches still dug there, barbed wire all over the place, bombed out buildings all over, and the stores absolutely empty. Very little food of any kind. We had to exist literally on imports from Sweden. We waited for the parcels to come from Sweden before we could feed ourselves properly. Mm-hmm. In the shops, there was nothing but potatoes and cabbage available, and so on. And not even thread or needle was available. We had to import thread and needle. No fruit, of course, of any kind.
Such was the condition.
Such was the condition. And people were very badly off, no shoes, very little clothing, and the bitter cold. So one can understand their problems. And they were very suspicious of all foreigners. It's an old Soviet tradition. And we were no exception. Now, when there's a period of such a bonhomie between India and the Soviet Union, you will hardly believe me when I say that my principal task then was to go to protest at the Foreign Office for the extremely damaging articles that used to appear about India in their papers. For example, the New Times, which is a magazine supposed to be issued by their labor organization, trade unions, had articles describing India as the running dog of British imperialism and Nehru as the Chiang Kai-shek of India. Well, in the Soviet lexicon, these were terms of abuse. And I was to seek an interview with the chief of the division, of the Asia division, South Asia division, Ambassador Mikhailov, seasoned diplomat, and a protest. Say, well, we came here as a friendly country and we want to establish good relations, but what's all this that's going on? And one day he felt a little sorry for me, and he said to me, he said, you know, we have an independent press, as you know. I said, yes. He said, this is a trade union paper. Now, if they want to have these views, they'll express them. They're free to express them if they want to. So there's nothing that we can do. So I said, I see, I understand. You have an independent press and this is an independent paper. That was that. Earlier, you see, when I arrived, Mrs. Pandit said to me, come on, let's go on a tour of this country. Let's make up a nice program. So we sat down and made up a program. Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara, Alma-Ata, Tbilisi, all these interesting places.
Asian Soviets.
Yes, very interesting part of the country. So, of course, those days for travel you had to go and get permission from here and there. So I went to the chief of protocol, Mr. Molotchkov. So I said, Mr. Molotchkov, here, Ambassador and I'm one or two officials want to go to those places. He said, oh, but we are the protocol department of the ministry. We're not a travel agency. So I said, oh, well, then where do I go? So he said, you go to Intourist, which is a Soviet travel agency. So I went to the Intourist. I said, well, this is the program. They said, you're diplomats? I said, yes. Ambassador. But we don't cater to the needs of diplomats. We only for the public. We don't deal with this matter. So where should I go? Go to protocol. So I went back to protocol, and this exercise went on 2 or 3 times. And no reply. Like a real Kafkaesque situation. We never went to Alma-Ata or Samarkand, Bukhara, or any of those places. Which of course increased Mrs. Pandit's frustration. But many years later, I had my revenge. When I was Foreign Secretary here, Dr. Zakir Hussain, President of India, had been invited on a state visit. So I told Dr. Zakir Hussain, I said, I'm going to make the program. So he left it to me. I put down all those places, Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, all the places I hadn't been able to go to then. This time, we were put up in the Kremlin. The president staying in a beautiful suite of rooms. I in another suite, which I learnt later had been occupied by the Tsar's concubines. But anyway, it was very sumptuous, with the biggest bathroom I've ever seen. And everything was laid on for us, red carpet wherever we went. Well, I could even get the program changed. I said, no, I don't want to go there, I want to go there. They said, well, here you are, here's a suite of cars for you. I had the Hermitage, a great museum, former Tsar's palace, tremendous works of art there. They had a museum of impressionistic paintings, rare paintings, Gauguin, Monet, I mean, you name it, worth millions and millions. But because it was regarded as decadent, it was all stored up in the attic. And then they had a museum of Scythian gold artifacts. They were also closed to the public. I said, I want to see those too. So they were opened up. And the paintings I saw there matched what they have in the Louvre in Paris. Great French painters all put away there. Then down below, the biggest array of gold that I've ever seen in my life. Room after room full of this Scythian gold. The very ancient, very valuable pieces. I just mentioned this. Well, when I went to complain to who was in charge of our division, that we've got no reply to our request to be allowed to travel, we're being sent from pillar to post. Again, he took pity on me and he said, no reply is itself a reply. So I said, another lesson I have learned. And so it went on. But you see, there was such secrecy those days that you didn't know whether Stalin was in town or not town. It was top secret. Mm-hmm. How we knew it was that my wife would go for a walk along a particular street called Arbat, a nice old street. And suddenly the policemen would come along and they'd start pushing out all the pedestrians into lanes and so on and so forth. And we suddenly found ourselves being pushed out. And then we sort of peep around the corner and see, going past it at a furious pace, a large number of black limousines, one after another, about half a dozen of them, and they would disappear. And then the street would be opened. So, Stalin was gone there. This is how we used to pick up the least scrap of completely innocuous information. Now, well, after Mrs. Pandit left, I must say, although we were very sorry to see her go because she was a charming woman and it was always a pleasure to be.
No, but did Russians have any special dislike for her?
No, not for her.
Or it was just a part of their policy?
Part of the policy, because they found that India was not going the way they wanted it to go from their own point of view. It was taking a genuinely independent course. And those were days when both the Russians and the Americans believed that those who were not with them were against them. So we had it from both sides, which I subsequently learned because my next posting was in the United States, to the United Nations. But I must say that although we regretted Mrs. Pandit's sudden departure, from a personal point of view, in one way I was not too unhappy because we then moved from a very dingy hotel rooms, we were not able to get an apartment or house, anything. Several months we spent in this horrible condition with inedible food, and I felt really quite ill. So we moved into the Mrs. Pandit's embassy, which at least was much more comfortable. There was we engaged a Russian cook, because in a hotel you can't cook your food. My wife told this woman Indian dishes too, so we could have Indian food and so on. So that was a great change for us. Otherwise, it was difficult to know how to survive. Especially the winter was something really unbelievable. The temperatures minus 30 degrees centigrade. You could hardly go out for 10 or 20 minutes without having your nose frostbitten. And of course covered in furs and fur-lined boots and gloves and everything else. But it gave us a lot of time to read, to study, and to try and learn the language, which my wife and I both tried to do. Now, sometime later, some months later, Dr. Radhakrishnan was nominated and he came. Of course, he had very simple habits. I met him there for the first time. He arrived carrying a book called I Chose Freedom by a Soviet defector called Kravchenko. It's rather popular. So when I saw that, you see, because he was received by the Chief of Protocol and some other Soviet officials and whatnot, I quickly rushed up and I took the book, snatched the book from him and took off the top cover, had it hidden. You can't arrive at a new post to the country with such a condemnatory book in your hands, you see.
Let me interrupt you here, sir. I think there's a tradition that when you appoint an ambassador to a country, you also consult that country. Was it not done in case of Mrs. Pandit and Mr. Radhakrishnan?
No, there's no such thing as consultation. The country which sends an envoy has the right to nominate whom it likes. But what's called the agrément, the agreement of the country concerned is taken in advance, but that is a mere formality. It's very unusual for a country to say that they don't want a person nominated as ambassador in their country. But let me make it clear that, of course, they had no animus against Mrs. Pandit, far from it. They should have been flattered that Pandit Nehru sent his own sister there. And indeed, she commanded a very high prestige as Nehru's sister. But it policy, their perspective, their perception of India and its policies at the time. Because Stalin believed in power. I'm sure it's an apocryphal story, but it said that Stalin asked the question, when he heard about the Pope, he said, how many divisions has the Pope? So you see, that was his attitude. Well, now he used to receive the American and the British and the French envoys, but he didn't receive the envoys of smaller countries. So it's a mixture both of doubts about India's policy as well as no great respect for India as a power in his estimation.
So now let us come back to Radhakrishnan's arrival in Moscow.
Yes, well, so we continued to stay in the embassy, and he said he had told Mr. Nehru when he was being appointed, he said, look, I have to finish my commentaries on the Upanishads. So he said, Prime Minister told me, he said, Moscow is the ideal place for you to complete that work, because there's not much that you have to do there. So he occupied a bedroom, there are 2 beds in it, one bed covered with books, and the other bed he used to lie down all the time or sit up looking at his papers and books and doing his manuscripts. Well, he asked me to assist him in reading the proofs and making corrections and so on, which I was very glad to do, because I too had a certain amount of spare time. So I feel proud to say that I did have some very marginal share in the production of that magnificent work. Of course, whenever any ambassador came to call on Dr. Radhakrishnan, he would sort of sit up and put on his trousers and in a long coat and sit in the next room and talk to him and send him off in about 15 minutes, come back and, get back into bed. And we used to go and sit by his side and chat with him, a man of a very great intellectual power and great humanity. When he arrived, he said, look, I know nothing about this profession, so just tell me what I'm to do. You keep on sending the reports as you've done, just show them to me, because it'll help me to keep in touch. And also tell me, we'll go for a walk every day, and we can talk about these things as to what's happening. Now, when we went to call on the foreign minister, who was then Wyszynski, who was acting as foreign minister, so I said, look, you should ask for an interview with Stalin. I said, you won't get it, but there's no harm in asking for it. So he said, when he asked for it, Wyszynski replied, and I'll never forget his words, he said, the possibility of that is not excluded. So when we came back in the car, Dr. Radhakrishnan asked me, so what does that mean? I said, well, I don't know what it means in the Soviet language, but I don't know, leaves you open or closed or what. However, soon after that, Dr. Radhakrishnan went off to Paris. He was the president of the executive board of UNESCO. He came back several months later, in January. And at night, at about 8:30 at night, Dr. Radhakrishnan was a very early riser. He used to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning and do his prayers and so on. And he used to go to bed by 9, he'd be fast asleep. We used to have dinner at 8 or something, and by 9 we'd sit and talk for a while. My wife would sing, or he'd hear some bhajans and so on, he'd go to sleep. So this telephone call came. And Dr. Radhakrishnan, he hated the telephone. He had a phobia for it. I went to the telephone, the chief of protocol on the line. He said, "No, I want to speak to the ambassador." So I said, yes, the ambassador asked me to get him a message. He said, no, this is for the ambassador. So I came to him and I said, "Look, he wants you." So he said, "Oh, I know. Stalin is giving me an interview." He said. He went there, and I was overhearing the conversation. He said, "Ambassador Radhakrishnan?" I said, "Yes." He said, "On such a day, you asked the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Andrei Vyshinsky, for an interview with the Generalissimo." So he said, "Yes, I did." So he said, "Would you be free to come tomorrow night at 9:30 to the Kremlin by such a gate?" So he said, "Yes, yes." So yes. So he said, "Then I'll discuss with Mr. Dayal all the arrangements. I suppose he'll be accompanying you?" He said, "Yes." Now he asked me to give him the name of the Russian chauffeur, which I did, and which gate we had to enter. Temperature those days was -30 at night, and Stalin generally used to receive envoys after midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Delegations would be received at 3 in the morning. But I think in Dr. Radhakrishnan's case, knowing that he went early to bed, they advanced the time and made it 9:30. It was already past Dr. Radhakrishnan's bedtime. However, we went empty streets, bitterly cold night. At the great gates, Colonel flashed a torch into our faces, examined the driver's identity card and books and so on. Then we followed the jeep into the Kremlin. The gates then closed behind us. There we arrived at a certain building where we marched through endless corridors, empty completely, where a lot of military people were sitting at a long table. We'd hardly sat down when interpreter Mr. Pavlov, he came and said, the Generalissimo is waiting for you. So we went into that room, big room, nobody there. He saw Stalin at the far corner. He came round, stood under the chandelier, clicked his heels, dressed in powder blue marshal's uniform, shook hands with Dr. Radhakrishnan and said, "Stalin," and that's the Russian way, you introduce yourself. Then he turned to me and said, "Stalin." I shook hands. I suppose he said that just in case we thought he was not Molotov or Trotsky or somebody there. Although we'd seen his pictures day after day all over the place with big hoardings. And we sat down at a conference table. From the other corner emerged the foreign minister, Vyshinsky, like a clerk carrying a pad. Stalin sat there in front, opposite him Dr. Radhakrishnan. Between the two of them, the interpreter, Vyshinsky next to Stalin, and I next to Dr. Radhakrishnan. When Vyshinsky pulled out his pad, I didn't know whether one could take notes. As I was leaving, my wife said to me, might be able to take notes. So there was no time to get any papers. So she quickly gave me her dhobi book, which I put into my pocket. So I took out my dhobi book and I began taking notes. I kept it practically verbatim account of it because I'd mastered enough Russian to be able to understand the conversation and the English translation also. We sat down. Then Stalin asked some questions. He said, is your army under a British commander? So Radhakrishnan said, no, we have an Indian commander-in-chief. General Cariappa had just been appointed. He said, do you have a navy? He said, yes, we have a navy. There are probably too little wartime discarded ships lying somewhere. Then Radhakrishnan said, yes, and we have an air force also. Some old Dakota planes lying here. So I see. This is a Maldive Islands under India? So Dr. Radhakrishnan looked at me and quite honestly I wasn't sure. So I said, well, I'm not sure. So we shook our heads. And then he said, why isn't Ceylon a part of India? So both said, well, we don't know why it's not a part of India, but it's been like that. He said, has India any influence in that part of the world? So Radhakrishnan said, yes, the very names Indonesia, Indochina, they bespeak Indian influence. Then he said, I have no more questions to ask. Have you any questions? So Radhakrishnan said, Mr. Stalin, he said, you say that you are a peace-loving nation. He said, yes, so why not? Of course we are a peace-loving nation. Look at the losses we suffered in the war fighting Nazi aggression. So Radhakrishnan said, yes, of course we are a peace-loving nation. We made great sacrifices in the cause of justice and peace. He said, but when you're a peace-loving nation, why don't you stop the Cold War? So Stalin looked very astonished. He said, stop the Cold War? How can I stop it? He said, what about the other people? So Radhakrishnan then looked at him and he put his hands together. He said, it takes two hands to clap. Why don't you withdraw your hand? Stalin kept quiet. He had no answer. Then he also said, look, I have no more questions. Then we got up. It must have taken with interpretation almost 1 hour, 50 minutes. Stalin was smoking all the time, one after another. He came out. When he came out, he said, look, Dr. Radhakrishnan, you had asked me to brief you. I said, look, you're a person in your own right. You don't have to get a professional view. So you be yourself and speak naturally to him. And that he did. But he said, please don't forget to call him Generalissimo. So he said, no, I forgot. I called him Mr. Stalin. So I said, well, that's all right. He said, what was the impression of the interview? He asked me. I said, look, I just don't know. There were very peculiar questions that Stalin asked, and I don't know whether they were very profound or very ignorant questions. A few days later, came 26th of January, our first Republic Day. And we stood, and Dr. Radhakrishnan and I, waiting for our guests to arrive. Promptly at the appointed time, we saw a whole galaxy of Soviet marshals and high officials coming in their uniforms up the stairs. Now, I knew enough about Moscow to realize that attendance at National Day functions by high officials meant that the embassy was in favor. So I said, well, now that's a good sign. Then I saw Vyshinsky coming, foreign minister. And there must have been at least a dozen very senior officials coming. Mostly they used to send only the chief of protocol and nobody else. So I said, well, something has happened. Then we took them inside, Vyshinsky and so on. Mr. Pavlov, the interpreter, came running to me and said, what did you think of the interview? So I said, well, I don't know. We don't know how it went. He said, don't you see? The marshal was pleased. That was the beginning of a change in the perception of the Soviet Union and Generalissimo Stalin himself towards India and her policies. Well, I left a short time afterwards, but let me just add as a postscript that thereafter Dr. Radhakrishnan was given several interviews by Stalin, and he was, I believe, the last ambassador to have seen him before he died. Such was the personal respect in which he was held, and the clearer perception about India's independence, genuine independence, which at last dawned on the Soviet leadership.
So, Mr. Dayal, yesterday we could clearly see that with Radhakrishnan meeting Stalin, he and you could succeed in having the ice in the Kremlin against India melted. and perhaps some sort of understanding of India began, or they wanted to study India's position. Now, much water seems to have flown down the Don, or the Ganges you may call it, and from that stage of indifference to very lovely bonhomie, when we depend upon each other type of relationship has begun. So even carving of this type of policy towards Soviet Russia must not have been easy one. It must have been very tortuous. And I think all along, in different capacities, you were in thick of it. Will you kindly tell us as to how this policy, Indo-Soviet policy, emerged, and actually who were the main people who were guiding it through?
Well, the evolution of India's policy towards the Soviet Union took place very gradually, as relations between states generally do. Of course, it's well known that Pandit Nehru was the architect of India's foreign policy, which was to maintain as good relations as possible with the superpowers and with all other countries. And the United States and the Soviet Union had special significance in this regard. Now, the change in the Soviet perception of the attitude towards India took place rather gradually, very tentatively. First, the ice was broken at the level that we discussed yesterday, the other day. But its effect on actual policy did not become visible until some time later, which was at the United Nations. Because till then, on the Kashmir issue, which was of primary concern to India at the time, one shouldn't forget that the war was still going on. Mm-hmm. And the Security Council was meeting very frequently over that issue. The Soviet Union always took a neutral stand on the theory that these are both semi-colonial countries, and their differences were no direct concern of the Soviet Union's. It was an attitude of indifference. Now, this changed only in 1953, after Pakistan began to take military aid from the United States. We can come to that later. That happened in a rather interesting way, which confirmed the general drift of Pakistan away from a policy of non-alignment, which they said at the time that they were following, without declaring in so many words, but they also tried to keep away from the conflicts of the superpowers. Now, the subsequent evolution of Soviet policy towards India has, of course, been conditioned by circumstances. Every country determines its foreign policy in regard to its own interests in relation to other countries in the neighborhood and further afield. Now, the Soviet Union is a global power, and we were still a regional power. They looked at their relations with India from the viewpoint of their global interests. And one important factor was our relations with the United States, which at that time, during the Korean War period, were extremely uneven. In fact, Mr. Dulles, who came after Mr. Dean Acheson, even characterized the Secretary of State, characterized India's policy of non-alignment as immoral. That was a point in our favor. So the Russians realized that we were not stooges of the West, which they thought initially. But after the victory of the Communist Party in China, the situation began to take a gradual turn. I happened to be in Moscow when the Kuomintang was overthrown, and Mao Zedong came to Moscow on what appeared superficially to have been a mission of thanks, to express gratitude for Soviet help.
Stalin was alive.
Stalin was alive. This was in 1949. And a goodwill visit would have been normally a very short one. A few days of banqueting and formal speeches and so on and so forth. Now, we didn't know exactly what was going on because everything was under a cloak of great secrecy, as things generally were in Moscow at the time. But Mao Zedong's stay there became more and more prolonged. And we were all puzzled as to why his visit was so long drawn out when his presence was urgently needed at home to consolidate his victory. It was much later that it transpired that it was not all plain sailing between the two countries. They had quite serious differences from the very start, because the Chinese never accepted any implication that the success of the revolution owed anything significant to the Soviet Union. In fact, earlier, the Soviet envoy to the Communist Party in China, while the civil war in China was going on, it was a person called Borodin, who was assisted incidentally by M.N. Roy. He was counseled, Mao Zedong was counseled to make his peace with the Kuomintang, because Stalin never took the Chinese Communist movement very seriously. But the theory still was that a revolution began with the urban proletariat and not with the rural masses. This was Karl Marx's theory. Now, this was something which the Chinese resented greatly, because they did not get much assistance from the Soviet Union during the struggle with the Kuomintang. And the long march and everything else, we know it was all very dramatic. So, in a very long report that I wrote to the Prime Minister
about Mao Zedong's visit to China.
And the Soviet perception of India at the time, I concluded with the report with a sentence that with China there, it might be a case of the tail wagging the dog, that the Chinese would not be satellites of the Soviet Union. Later on, Panditji wrote a very long note in his own handwriting.
Which was forwarded to you?
Yes, and basically agreeing with what I said. Also, I said that they were not then taking us too seriously, because we didn't have much economic or military power. And these are factors which are respected in international affairs. And the value of our potential was not at that time readily accepted. But with the evolution of Soviet policy, it came to be recognized that India could become a significant power, that India could pursue an independent policy, and what is more, with the emergence of the non-aligned movement and India's implicit leadership of that movement, that India's role in the international polity would become more and more important.
But I suppose non-aligned came much later, no? Non-aligned movement.
Yes, that came much later as a movement.
Yeah.
But the glimmerings of non-alignment were there from the start, which were very much evident at the United Nations. It was a case of open diplomacy.
What you were saying in those days, active neutrality or something?
No, we never used the phrase neutrality. We always used took the position of saying that we were not involved in the Cold War. We had nothing to do with the rivalry between the superpowers. And we thought that this rivalry was a menace to peace. And therefore they should resolve their differences peacefully.
Right.
This was our line, which it still is. Now, the relations between India and the Soviet Union became deeper the rift, and a very serious rift it was, between the Soviet Union and China, which came into the open in Khrushchev's time. Stalin had his own suspicions of Mao Zedong, but Khrushchev it was who really embittered relations a great deal. And the Chinese had various complaints that they were not giving them sufficient technical assistance, not passing on sufficient military know-how and all that sort of thing. And then there were those very serious border demands, claims made by the Chinese, resisted by the Soviet Union. And large numbers of divisions were massed along the Ussuri River, and fighting took place, and so on and so forth. That was a very, very difficult period between the two countries. And in dealing with the Soviet Union, the leading personalities from the foreign minister down, they all used to speak. They had a kind of obsession about the Chinese. Mm-hmm. Whatever the topic, they'd say how difficult the Chinese were, and so on, and lamenting what was going on in China. Well, now especially after the 1962 episode, when the Chinese breached our borders, northern borders, the Soviet attitude towards India changed further, because by that time the bye-bye period between India and China was definitely over. And then they tried to befriend us. Though not at that particular time. In 1962, they referred to us as a good friend and the Chinese as a brother. Mm-hmm. They regretted this clash between us. At that time, of course, it was we turned to the Western powers for military assistance, which we received in very full measure. But it was because of our rift with China that relations really improved further, intensified. Then, of course, with improved relations came trade. This rupee agreement, I know the people who criticize the agreement, because very often what is said is that goods bought in India against rupees are then re-exported by the Soviets to other countries against dollars.
That's right.
So we lose foreign exchange in the process. On the other hand, people say that, well, our goods would not have found a market, these goods in the Western countries, so that it gives a fillip to our exports and to our industry. So it's a question of balancing the pros and cons. Also, I think that the development of the non-aligned movement and India's growing importance, growing economic and military strength, and the demonstration that India is today, without any question, the dominating power in the whole Indian Ocean area, the Soviet attitude towards us has changed very much. And not only of the Soviet Union, other countries also see India's great potential.
So you attach a lot of importance to India's economic stability and military strength.
Yes, and also political stability. Because in our part of the world, and in Southeast Asia generally, political stability is a very rare thing. And we have tried to maintain a form of democracy. So all these factors, I think, have gone into the Soviet perception, as well as the perception of other countries. But because of our neighborhood with the Soviet Union, and as it happens...
Oh, but as you said earlier, we were certainly under pressure from the superpowers or semi-superpowers, as you may call it, like United Kingdom or France or United States. How could you develop such a policy when you were under pressure and you also needed them perhaps at that time?
Well, it was a tightrope walking, very difficult at the United Nations, as I found when I went there straight from Moscow. Because whatever line we took on issues there, we displeased one superpower and its friends, or the other superpower and its friends. It was a much more comfortable position to be on one side or the other. And we frequently found ourselves almost in isolation, either abstaining on an issue or taking a line different to the majority on both sides. One country which after 1948, also the United Nations took a somewhat similar line, was Yugoslavia, curiously enough. But we can come to that later. So I think these are the sort of factors which have gone into the make of Indo-Soviet relations.
We should discuss Indo-Soviet treaty here or at later stage. I leave it to you.
Well, we can discuss it here.
Because how a situation came like that and relationship improved to this level. Because in that situation, when we entered into that treaty, could as well have meant war with United States.
No, that's. I don't think the United States is going to fight a war on the subcontinent.
Or it may have been a deterrent to them, taking.
No, I think one reason for it was the question of getting arms from abroad, because we kept out of any kind of military entanglements. That's a fundamental part of India's foreign policy. Participants of no pacts or bonds of that nature. And it was difficult to get arms from the Western countries unless we belonged to this pact or the other. So therefore we turned to the Soviet Union. And that context also that we entered in this Treaty of Peace and Friendship. I know it was quite strongly criticized at the time that we were entering the Soviet orbit, but we have since concluded similar treaties with a number of countries. I believe the very first such treaty that we had concluded was with Switzerland, because I don't think Switzerland had any intention of invading India or Switzerland. It was regarded as just a friendly sort of gesture. I don't think it involves any other very serious military considerations.
No, but the situation in which it came off, that led to many type of thinking.
It was regarded as a sort of revulsion against Western policies and so on, and swinging to the other side. But subsequently, I think
to counterbalance perhaps American interference in favor of Pakistan during those days.
These are all sort of factors, because that's a factor in our psyche, relations with Pakistan, and also a factor which creates, distortions in our foreign policy.
Perspective, yes.